So, what I'd like to do is work with the five elements and see to focus more on their interrelatedness in this class. And again, the central theme of this whole class has been relationships as a mirror, the golden mirror. And when you think about a relationship, it might be easiest to think about a partnership or somebody you're close to, close friendship who you see regularly. And if you embrace this idea that that person is a mirror for you and that we can't see ourselves clearly on our own. We see ourselves through relationship. Then when you imagine that person, you can imagine seeing yourself, your relationship to yourself, your ability to remember yourself, to be aware of your thoughts, emotions, your experience, beliefs, actions. And then you imagine the other person and you can empathize, you can connect with them, you can imagine them, all your ideas and beliefs and thoughts and feelings about that other person, the way that you interact with them. And then there's a third presence, which is the mirror. And if both of you are acting like a mirror for one another, what happens when you face two mirrors? It creates an infinity mirror. And so this idea of our mirroring one another, it can show us that we're not independent. We're not an independent self that's just floating around in the world without being in relationship to everything and everybody we come into contact with. And so when we relate to relationships as mirrors, they can start to loosen the fixed attitudes and the structures of identity, of this idea of a self, and all of our narrative, our autobiographical story we tell ourselves about ourselves. It can start to loosen up the tightness of those structures of identity and to show us new glimpses and visions of who we are, not as a fixed identity, but as an impersonal process of transformation that we're constantly transforming in life. And in this ways, relationships are such a gift when we can open to them in that way and not see other and stop othering each other so often. And recognize that, I am you and you are me. This term in Lakesh, the recognition of the interdependence of people and of all life. This is the real gift of relationship. So I wanted to open this talk with, there's a Zen story that it's from this guy, Zhao Chongshen, he was alive in the 700s. He's very important in Chan Buddhism. And he's one of these archetypes of like a holy fool or a trickster or like a coyote bodhisattva. Um, a little bit, he's an absurdist. He's a bit of an anarchist. And so a lot of the stories that are told about him, he's a beloved figure in Zen. Um, and, I'm sorry if this offends people out there, but there are a lot of absurd stories of monks coming to him with these very profound, deep questions and his responses being ridiculous. So, in the Blue Cliff records, which are worth exploring, there's a monk asks Zhao, what is a true statement? And he replied, your mother is ugly. It's very Zen. So I'm sorry if yo mama jokes offend you, but he was a real smartass, and that's probably why I like him. My name in the tradition I studied in is Qingyu, which means clear fool, and it can be translated in different ways, like clearing away foolishness, or clearly fooling around, or clearly foolish, which is most certainly the case. So I like a lot of these trickster teachers because humor breaks up that fixed identity. It breaks up the conditioned mind. It breaks the patterns of thought that we're always stuck in. Humor is a very important part of inner work. And so, in this story, a monk asks him, "What is the way?" And he replies, "The cypress tree in the courtyard." And I like this story because he doesn't speak of enlightenment or a doctrine, or he doesn't point to heaven. He speaks of something alive, the cypress tree in the courtyard. There's something growing, there's something rooted, and it's also something seasonal. And the five elements are like this tree. They're not theories. They're not personality labels or identities. They're not ways of assessing your partner or your friends and putting them into boxes as an element. They're movements of life. It's the way that life moves. They're dynamics. They're relationships. So spring pushes and the summer opens and the late autumn ripens or integrates and the autumn refines. And in the winter, we return to the depths, to the unknown, or to the gate of life and death. And we're not one of these things, we're the whole cycle, because humans are nature. We contain all of the elements. And most suffering in relationships comes from mistaking a season for the self. So we cling to the spring, or we resist winter, or we demand summer in moments that are meant for autumn. This course has been about recognizing the ecology of the nervous system and to see the ways in which we try and protect ourselves. And to notice how oftentimes that self-protective mechanism can create distortion in relationship. Something to remember in nature is that nothing is wasted and nothing is wrong. But sometimes things are out of balance in the natural world, but it autocorrects, self-corrects. So every conflict in relationships, there's part of it which is an elemental imbalance. So I want to move through the elements, not as five personality types, but of aspects of movement or aspects of development, and also as opportunities for cultivation. In the Taoist tradition, we work with the elements to cultivate them, to refine them, and to understand them as aspects of the self, but not the self itself. I'm going to have a very oversteeped cup of tea now. All the things that we're exploring in the five elements can be explored very intimately in tea, which is really central to what we do at Living Tea. I think people know that. So I want to talk a little bit about the elements, but through a very stripped down lens. So in each of the classes, we went into all different aspects of each element. And in this class, I want to just speak to something essential about the element, an essential flavor, a base note, you know. So with wood, we're talking about the springtime, which is about emergence. We're starting to move into that energy right now and becoming. So if the water element is about being, wood is about becoming. It's about birth. It's about the sapling emerging from the earth. It's about direction and purpose and conscience. Conscience is the quiet voice that's guiding us. So when we look at the wood element, we're looking at the courage to face everything and avoid nothing, and that sapling or the plant kingdom, it's moving upwards and facing the sun. It's moving into the light of consciousness. It's that in us which wishes to move towards the light. The way that wood loves, that it expresses care in life, is through growth. So wood people, they want to grow. They're always pushing forward. They need direction and purpose. And the way they bond with other beings is through shared direction, right? Would people want shared direction and to feel like we're going somewhere here? And what it needs is honesty, and respect. Would people, they want to be respected for their commitment to growth. Now, where the shadow shows up in wood is in forcing things to happen. You can't force growth. And so the wood shadow, when the ego comes in, it will try and force things to happen that aren't ready to happen, maybe. It also can come out in needing to be right. Or when wood collapses, it collapses into indecision. It can't make decisions. And in the wood class, I talked about the difference between indecision in metal or indecision in water and wood. With anything I say about any element, you can find a flavor of it in the other elements. It just looks different. So with wood, anger is not pathology. It's truth that's unacted upon. So when anger arises in the body, it's telling us something here needs to change. And when we don't act upon it, it will become pathological. So when wood becomes mature, it becomes power without aggression and clarity without domination. Really with wood energy, and I understand wood and because it's my predominant element. Um, what is central to it is becoming oneself, becoming yourself. So we're in the realm of creative self-authorship and really taking the reins of one's life and choosing the life, choosing to author your life, choosing what direction and what growth matters to you. And also being in contact with the conscience, right? Are you being guided by your conditioning, by habits, by unconscious beliefs? Or are you being guided by the voice of your conscience? Okay. I'm going to have to be very metal, very essential to move through this in the next 15 minutes. I'll do my best. When we work with fire, we're working with connection and joy and intimacy. It's the spark of connection between people. It's what lights us up. Fire is the Shen in the heart, but it is the thing that's essential for relationships is that it is light, not heat. Heat is secondary. So healthy Shen radiates. It doesn't seek intensity, right? This is a big thing because people with a healthy Shen, there's an ease of identity, a lightness in the eyes because we see the Shen in the eyes. There's no urgency to define things. It's not intimacy that's um, ungrounded, grasping, so full of desire that it can't be present to the other person. Real healthy Shen, healthy fire loves through presence. And really what the heart wants is just presence, you know, to see and be seen in presence, not through the lens of desire. It's not that desire is unhealthy. It's that when desire is not present, when it's not through the lens of presence, it becomes consuming and urgent. And what the Shen wants is presence. When the Shen is settled in the heart, when a person has a healthy heart, a clear heart, what's called Qing Xin in Chinese, when the heart is clear and the Shen is settled, not knowing feels intimate. This is where Jing and Shen come together. So the wisdom of water and the consciousness of fire, you could think about this as Shiva and Shakti or Jing and Shen, yin and yang. When they are in harmony, not knowing feels intimate. We're at peace with not knowing, which is the water element. And through that, we can face our fears and wisdom arises, insight arises. So healthy or fire really needs emotional reciprocity. It needs to be felt. Fire people want to connect. They're the social butterflies. They're full of joy. The heart's full of joy, right? Now, openness and warmth are so important to fire, but it has to be grounded, right? Or else it becomes urgent and people burn out or they become addicted to things, that kind of thing. So the shadow in fire is drama instead of intimacy, or sex as regulation instead of as communion. So when we talk about the earth, moving into the earth is about stability and nourishment and reciprocity. Um, earth in the body, right, is the digestive system. So the stomach and the spleen and the pancreas, the duodenum, the jejunum. It's all the whole complex digestive process, which works in stages. Um, and in nature, right, earth is the soil that transforms decay into nourishment, right? It's the place where things in Chinese medicine, we call it rotting and ripening, right? And the earth types love through steadiness. They say, I'm here, you are not alone, right? There's a presence. If you know an earth type in your life, which of course you do, they're the people that are always available. They're present. They're present for you. They're solid. They're reliable. They're accountable. They're just solid, you know? You can trust in their consistency, in their reciprocity. When the earth becomes distorted or the shadow, it becomes worried and overgiving and ruminating. What is rumination? It's when you're not digesting, right? You're just going over and over and over and over the same thing. And so with the shadow and earth, people will give and give and give, but they don't take care of themselves. Or they're giving from a place of, I secretly am doing this to get something in return from you, right? Undigested experiences become pensiveness or rumination. So people who don't have a healthy, consolidated earth element, they tend to worry a lot, and they don't actually integrate and digest experiences. But when the earth elements mature, it becomes care for others without controlling. It also becomes support for others without self-erasure, without negating oneself. Now, one of the things necessary for earth types to integrate is to stay long enough in experience to integrate it and to honor their own needs. Earth types need to honor their own needs. If we aren't resourced and we can't take care of ourselves, we cannot take care of other people. And that's, I see this a lot in like spiritual communities of people who give and give and give, but they compromise their own well-being. So they don't know where that line is, you know? Or they have so many gifts to offer and they just give it all away, but they're never compensated. And so they struggle to be resourced in life, you know? Okay. With metal, we're moving into the autumn. We're moving into refinement and order. We're moving into integrity. The autumn is the breath. It's the being in touch with mortality, to remember that you will die. That brings great integrity to one's life when they have a relationship to their mortality. Metal loves through integrity. It also says, I will not betray myself. So metal types check in with themselves first. Does this feel aligned? Is there coherence and integrity here? They're very sensitive to when something's out of alignment. They really need respect for their boundaries. They also need sincerity and authenticity from people so they can detect falseness or inauthenticity immediately. The shadow in metal is withdrawal. It's armor disguised as dignity. So metal types, if they become too boundaried, it can turn into armor, even when armor isn't necessary. Metal types fear disappointment. And if they are in that space, they themselves can become performative. So this fear of disappointment, of disappointing or being disappointed, is part of where some of those boundaries can come from. It's very important for metal types to learn to let go without bitterness so they don't become cynical or critical. A task for the metal is to release what's non-essential, to not hold on to things that don't need to be held on to, and also to allow in through trust and opening, to allow things in. The breath is the medicine of metal because breathing brings us into presence and into what matters in a moment and to soften. Okay, moving into water, into the last element. Water's about surrender. It's the realm between form and formlessness. It's the ocean beneath the boat, the vast ocean. And when we look into the ocean, we fear the unknown in the depths. Cultivating water is about facing the unknown and facing one's deepest fears and transforming that fear into wisdom. So water shows love and care through continuity, not through intensity. They love from the depths. What they need is time and safety and to not be pressured. They live in the depths. But one of the, I guess you could say a risk or something of waters is if they get lost in the depths, too deep into the emotions, too deep into the unconscious. And they can have a hard time coming then to the surface. So the shadow in water is withdrawal. It can also show up as hypervigilance or paranoia. Um, and the last aspect of the shadow is focusing on survival instead of integrity, right? Being in survival mode. What awakens water is recognizing that fear is not the self, to disidentify with those fears. I was reminded there's an important line from the Tao Te Ching, which of course Bruce Lee made even more famous, where he says, "Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water. Yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it." So, what is the strength of water, the power of water, right? The Grand Canyon is carved by water, and yet water is the softest and the most yielding. There's extraordinary power in that softness. So with the mature water, there's depth without collapse or withdrawal, and there's trust that comes from wisdom. So for water, one must surrender without disappearing, without withdrawing. Okay. Now, kind of the key thing I want to get into here is how the elements heal each other. And I'm going to move through this a little bit fast, but we're going to record it so that if you want to go back, because these are kind of big ideas, it's going to take, you might have to listen to it again if you want to take it in. So I want to talk about the generating cycle, which is wood into fire, into earth, into metal, into water, which I talked about in the introductory class. That's called the generating cycle. And I want to talk about it in the context of relational repair. So as water moves into wood, trust allows for growth. When wood moves into fire, clarity fuels intimacy and connection. When fire moves into earth, connection creates bonding and stability. When earth moves into metal, security allows for refinement, right? When you think of earth, you think of that stability, and in metal, refinement. As metal moves into water, grief deepens into wisdom. So you can think about all of those in terms of, okay, if you're in touch with the water element and trust has been developed through facing one's fears, that then is the water that nourishes the root system in a tree. And that's what lends itself to that wood element, to the growth, right? When there's fire element, for example, that connection, that intimacy, that vulnerability, that connection creates bonding, which then allows for the stability in earth. So if you just, again, this course is about seeing the elements, starting to see the way they show up. But where conflicts start to happen in relationships often, right, is when wood energy starts pushing water. So this is going in the wrong direction in the cycle. When fire, desire, passion, intimacy begins to overwhelm metal and the boundaries don't feel respected. When the earth element begins to smother wood. So earth's all about stability and groundedness, and wood wants to grow. So an earth person might smother that wood energy. It doesn't feel supported. Metal energy can chill fire. So too much boundaries, too much integrity, too much order, too much um, sense of clarity around everything can smother the passion and the desire for connection in fire, you see. So metal can be too cooling for the fire. Water can extinguish fire, right? So the problem is rarely love or care. The problem is elemental misattunements. And this is where it can be so helpful to understand how we're working with the elements with others and with ourselves. I said in the first day of the class, one of the reasons that learning the elements is so helpful is that we can begin to shift from why are you like this to what does this element need? That alone can save relationships, can heal relationships. Okay. Last thing. This is working with your own constitution, right? So we are not one element, we are patterns of elements. And I think questions you can sit with, which I think you already have been in the course, is what element dominates when I'm stressed out? Which element do I judge in others? That can show you your triggers, right? And that's a place you can work on that element in yourself. What element triggers me? Oftentimes, as we become more familiar with the elements, we begin to notice, oh, earth people trigger me. It's always earth people because of X. And again, staying away from words like always and never. Um, you know, I've had some lessons around that recently, but typically whenever you're using the words, you never take out the trash. You always this, you never that. It's the ego speaking. It's the nervous system trying to regulate itself. And then which element feels least developed in me, right? Bringing attention to that. So growth in cultivational work is not becoming someone else. It's completing your cycle. So we start to learn, where am I deficient and where am I in excess? Where is my shadow work? Where are my triggers? And the elements provide a really helpful framework to see that. The more you begin to look in nature for the elemental movements, the more you awaken those relationships and that connection, and the language will become much more vivid. So the final thing, integration here, is kind of a mandala. And I want you to think about a forest for a moment. A forest without fire becomes diseased. A forest without water becomes a desert. It can't grow. A forest without metal becomes overgrown or devoid of the minerals that provide nourishment. Without the earth element, nothing can stabilize. Without the wood element, nothing grows. So the mature human cycle isn't just a cycle of awakening, it's also just the seasons of life, you know? When you think about a life cycle of a human, if they live a full life, the early years is all that wood element energy. Think about the energy of a child, you know? And we move then into the fire season where it's all about connection. It's all about relationships. Think about young people, right? As we move into the earth period, if you think of it in 20-year periods, so 40 to 60, it's integration, right? I'm in my earth period now. We're digesting. We've had enough life experience that we have something to integrate and digest. And then when you move into the metal period in life, you're refining. You're cutting away what's non-essential. It's the distillation. So instead of digesting, you're distilling. And then the final cycle is wisdom, right? Think about people who have lived a life of cultivation. When you see them in their later years, the wisdom is in the eyes, the Shen is there. So they've faced all their fears through life, through a life of cultivation, and arrived at wisdom, the sage, right? So the cycle of the five elements is also the life cycle of a human being through the seasons of their life. There's nothing really that you have to do with these elements. There's another, Lao Tzu also says in the Tao Te Ching, nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. This isn't about fixing something. It's not about transcending something. It's really about ecological balance. It's about balancing. It's about coming into balance. That's the basis of the medicine. And if you remember one thing from this course, this is your takeaway. Every reactive pattern in relationship is an element trying to protect something. Every protection, or rather, when protection becomes conscious, it becomes virtue. When that virtue becomes embodied, becomes lived, relationships become practice. And practice, when it is lived, becomes awakening. There's no relationship that's not practice. So the last thing I'll share is whatever element you're working with, I want you to remember that softness is not weakness in the water element. Grief is not a failure in the metal element. Anger is not pathological in the wood element. Distance or space is not indifference in the metal element. Intensity is not intimacy in the fire element. They are all movements. They're movements of chi, right? When chi moves on the outside, we have the weather. When chi moves on the inside, we have the emotions. So they're movements of energy. So there's an old Taoist story. If you've ever attended any of my talks or classes, you probably have heard me tell it before, where a farmer's horse runs away and the neighbors say, "Oh, how terrible." And the farmer replies, maybe. And then the horse returns, but it brings three wild horses with it. And the neighbors come over and they say, "How amazing, how wonderful." And the farmer says, maybe. And then the farmer's son breaks his leg training one of the wild horses. And the neighbors say, "How tragic." And he says, "Well, maybe." And then war comes and the troops come and they're drafting all the young men. But the son is spared because his leg is broken from training the horse. You know, good and bad, loss and gain, opening, closing, these are seasons that are turning. And the world is turning, and so are we. You know, the elements are constantly moving. You know, so awakening is not about being calm or empty forever. It's not about being intimate and connected forever or decisive forever or safe forever. It's learning to move and to begin again and to see clearly what each moment is asking of us. This is why spontaneity is so important in Zen and in Taoism, to see clearly moment by moment, to begin again. What is this moment asking of me?